early May, Blackpool Teaching Hospital's NHS Foundation Trust was fined £185,000 by the United Kingdom's Information Commissioner's Office for inadvertently publishing the personal details of 6,500 of its staff on its website. And last week, retailer KittyCare announced that 800,000 customers were impacted after a test site using real customer information was compromised by hackers. The incidents highlight a growing problem. Organizations have more data than ever, and that sensitive data is often being shared with other departments or with third parties for a variety of purposes. On today's Cyber Chat, we talk with Datawatch Chief Product Officer Jon Pilkington and Chief Marketing Officer Dan Potter about business intelligence, the importance of data masking, and how businesses can protect their sensitive information when it's being shared both inside and outside of the organization. First, I wanted to ask you guys about business intelligence in general. I know you guys have been in the field for quite a while and been doing different things in there. And obviously, like even here at Surfwatch, we use business intelligence to help visualize all of our threat intelligence data. And it seems like all organizations have just all this data that they're trying to utilize. So just curious, your general thoughts on business intelligence and how it's changed over the years?
This is John. I'd be glad to answer that. So I actually worked at Cognos, started out in Cognos back in 1994 before it was actually called business intelligence. And I spent 5 years kind of doing the same thing at Prudential before I even came over to Cognos. And I was with Cognos for the better part of 13 years. So I've been, my entire career has been spent in whether you call it business intelligence or, you know, what it was called prior, report design and report mining type stuff. What the trends that I've seen in the 90s, when we first started coming out with business intelligence, it was the first time people started to get very excited because they now had accessibility to a lot of the data that they could just simply never get at before, because it was just in the report, a standard report that would come as a hard copy on their desk, and then that's all they'd get, and there was no way to start pulling it together and blending and merging it. And it was wide open. It was the Wild West. So since it was so new, you had business analysts that would take charge and go out and get information, and they were very resourceful. And they were I'll call it the data heroes within their organization. And then as that continued to spread throughout the late 90s and 2000s, you started to see a lot of corporate governance come into place. You started to see a lot of IT organizations start to lock down the data. As part of them locking down the data, the freewheeling self-service nature of the early 90s went away. And now you started creating data silos, not just from data marts and data warehousing perspectives, but you created data silos from a business intelligence perspective. So you had a business objects universe or a Cognos framework manager specifically defined for HR. Then you'd have another one defined for sales and marketing. And then you'd have another one designed for supply chain. And those never talk to one another. So this lockdown of the data and then all the governance over the top of it made it very, very difficult for people to extend their analytic view beyond the core data that they had. So now you come full circle back in Tableau and the reach of their product really reintroduced self-service analytics. And the self-service analytics has now really empowered the business to say, hey, I have been unable to do my job. You need to give me access to this because I'm using it with artifacts coming from my desktop and whatever data I can get to, and I'm finding insights in the data that are really compelling and can help us change the way that we do business or the course of these different operations that we're dealing with, operational processes. So with that came the challenge of, boy, I now need to get access to this data, but I'm spending 80 to 90% of my time trying to get all the data in the right shape to get into this business intelligence application. That's always been the case. It's been the case back from when I started in the early 90s to now. But the self-service nature of Tableau and more business people finding a way that they can actually use the data themselves has really exposed the fact that while the data is out there and it's still in many different silos, and it's in different forms, whether it's relational or multi-structured or JSON or XML or HTML. All these different sources are now available, but damn, it's hard to get all that information into one place. And so we've started to see a major trend where anyone who's using business intelligence is trying to find a way to spend more of their time doing analysis and less of their time doing what we call data preparation. And that's kind of where we've come to fit into the market, is how can we help people gather that data from any type of data source and then get it in the form so they can actually consume it. And we look at savings of that 80% of the time people are spending doing that. We can reduce that by 60-70% of the time. And that's a trend that people are starting to pick up on and say, boy, if I can make things repeatable, if I don't have to do these things the same way over and over again, but manually, and I can save that time by having it automated, I'm in. And that's a trend that we're seeing in business intelligence now, is that more people want more data because it gives them a more complete view of whatever they're trying to make a decision on, or whatever they're trying to find in it. And the more diverse the data, if you can blend all that together, the fuller the picture is.
I'm curious what types of data your customers are using. I mean, I know this doesn't really apply to cybersecurity so much, but I'm kind of a data nerd myself because I end up working with this all the time. So curious what your customers are using Datawatch for and what types of business intelligence they're getting from it.
Yeah, good question, because we actually have, I'll call it a very horizontal approach to it. When you look at a business analyst, you'll see a lot of desktop artifacts. You'll see Excel and CSV, and there's a lot of Microsoft Access out there that people use to maintain their own data. And then we're watching as people are taking that information, which I'll call their own personal curated data sets, and they're merging that with data that they're pulling from their operational systems or their data warehouses. And then they continue to work on that, and whether it's they use it for analysis or they use it for put it into an operational process. And I'll give you two examples of that. That's a typical, relational, whether it's Oracle, and if it's IBM or Microsoft SQL Server, still the most popular ones. But we're seeing people get into big data with Cloudant and Cloudera and some of the other players. We're watching more of the retailers and other organizations get involved in things like JSON files. We're watching people want to scrape the web to enrich data with third-party data sources that are easily accessible. And what we're seeing way more of than we've ever seen are people wanting to use third-party data or even internal, which I'll call third-party documents to get at the information. And the reason I call it third-party makes sense if you've got something that comes from outside the four walls of the organization. But there's a lot of corporate reporting that comes in the form of a PDF report, but you don't have the ability to query that data source. And since you can't query the data source, the only data that you get is sitting in that PDF, which you can slowly cut and paste and spend days going through, or you can retype it yourself. And what we allow people to do is actually take that PDF document and transform it into rows and columns, and it immediately becomes a data set. So where you see the extension of that is we have people in financial services markets quite a bit that are using this. We do have companies that use it from a manufacturing perspective, taking log files, which would be the same thing as a cybersecurity piece, to monitor the machines that are doing injection molding to raise the yield up and improve that. Intel uses us across the same thing across their machines, taking data from performance data from each of the machines in the form of log files, and then continues to evolve and improve their operational processes there. So while it is a wide blend, if I had to put percentages on it, majority are still the desktop artifacts, the Excel-based Microsoft Access CSV tab or comma delimited data, and then the rest would really fall into industry-specific needs, the JSON stuff or the XML, or in healthcare, we run into that quite a bit as well.
Yeah, I'm curious to know, a little more on the security side. You mentioned, in the late 90s, people started getting more concerned about the data that they have. So I'm just wondering now, obviously cybercrimes, it's in the news, all the time. It's all over the headlines. Is that something that comes up right away when you're dealing with these organizations and they're talking about their data, or is it something that you still think maybe it's kind of on the back burner a little bit?
It's the business. Quite frankly, the business just wants something that's going to save them time to do their jobs. But then you've got the oversight of the IT organizations and the governance organizations. And what's become of this self-service trend, which I call, back to the 90s, so to speak, this self-service trend has identified gaps in people's governance in dealing with data, because they're offloading data from its originating source for the purposes of getting their job done. So in the past, it used to drive me nuts when somebody goes, "You're not allowed to use that data unless it's in its originating source." And you'd say, "Well, I can't use it there to get what I need." And they go, "Well, that's too bad." And IT can't do that with the business anymore. But now they've got to put the steps in place to make it so they have an understanding of the data lineage and the changes and the adaptations that have been made to the originating data source, so they can track it all the way through. So if you can imagine, if I'm an analyst and I give somebody a Tableau report and my executive team's going to make decisions on that, it would be good to know that someone could always back check my data and figure out how I got there. And that's not necessarily the case with most self-service analytic products. However, what we do is we actually track every single change that's been made to the originating data. We show the data lineage of where it came from, how each new bit was derived, what its children were, or what its parents were, and then continue to make all that easily accessible, and it gets saved for perpetuity within what we call our workspace. So if I take 12 different tables from 8 different sources and change 100 different columns and manipulate the data, to the nth degree, and I save that workspace, every single thing that I've done, how I did it, when I did it, is all saved within that workspace. So anybody can go back and check it. The good part about saving all that and making sure we do all that, that what we call our governance with a small g, because it's not the governance that people are really thinking about, is that this also, as a byproduct, makes everything we just did repeatable. So you have the same process with just different data. You can sit this on top of it and run it all from beginning to end without actually having to go through and recreate anything. It's all there. Dan, you want to add anything with regards to the governance and compliance side of things?
No, I just emphasize that as business intelligence has moved to more self-service, the types of assets and the types of risks really increase, because a lot of times people are taking Excel extracts as the basis of the self-service analytics. And the big concern and the big risk is around data breach, because now you've got data being moved from governed systems like a database or data warehouse that are well managed and well governed and controlled, to something that is now living on the desktop of an analyst, and then therefore being shared with other people in a non-governed way. So that's something very important. The other thing that's related to that is if the data now is going to be being moved around in a self-service analytics way, and the data is going to flow with the visualization. Think of something like a Tableau. If I'm building a Tableau workbook on my desktop and I'm sharing that with other users in a non-Tableau server fashion, the data is moving around with my analysis. It becomes very important to make sure that sensitive data is being either redacted completely or it's being masked in some way to make sure that you're staying compliant, either industry compliance or corporate compliance. For example, if you're in the healthcare space, patient information, you want to make sure that if you're conducting analysis based on patient information, you want to either redact customer names or you want to provide a consistent alias to the customer. So it's non-identifiable. If that information gets leaked or breached, it's not identifiable, but the people who are doing the analysis are able to aggregate and view patient information using a consistent alias. So they're getting the insights that they need, but you're protecting that sensitive information. Credit card, social security numbers, there's a whole host of other kinds of data that people need to be very, very careful with in making sure that, again, they're masking it in some way. Because as you move to self-service analytics, it does create more risk.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you guys about that because in our own data, SurfWatch Labs, we collect a lot of data on different cybercrime events, and we see so many different supply chain related breaches. And just wondering, I guess, what the process of like this data masking is. If you go into that a little bit, is it pretty automated where it kind of automatically does it once you set it up, or is it each time you create something, you're sharing it, you got to go into it? And just if you could explain a little bit of that.
Let me give you some background as to where and how we came up with our redaction. And we do something called pseudonymization, right? So if I apply a pseudonym to a specific item like Dan Potter and it applies to his name, it'll stay consistent throughout the document, right? So we know in different places where it shows up. So we actually had National Health Services out in the UK pose this problem to us. They were an existing user of our Monarch product, and in a meeting with them, the gentleman said, here's the issue. We have 17 vendors that are all producing reports, and I need to put redaction in because I have administrators who work with the data that don't need to see the patient information. However, my physicians and people working in the labs to some extent may need to see that data. So if I need to do redaction, I need to go to 17 different vendors and go about having them all build and put redaction in their product. And he goes, and you realize that I'll probably be dead before that actually happens. So he goes, if you could put redaction into your product, then any report that comes out of any system, since I can define a model to a specific report, I can automatically define the redaction and pseudonymization across each of these and define it once and run it many times. So the whole goal there was I'm never going to get everyone to do it. I've got one place I believe can do it. It can all be automated. It can be set up once. I define a model per report, and if all the other reports look the same, it can run through one model, and I can have 10 million reports run through that one model, and therefore I get everything that I need from one vendor. And he's like, "Can you do that?" And that's kind of where the impetus for us making sure we got a real strong approach to this, and we leveraged a lot of what they had in their functional spec of what they were looking for to build into this ability to handle it. And then as Dan had mentioned, a lot of companies are now starting to say, hey, if I have self-service analytics and I need to share data, and if I'm sharing data, once it's out of a system, I don't have full control over it. So the only control I have is by doing redaction over specific fields, and then once that data is there, I can go off and run with it myself, and feel safe to the fact that I'm not violating any corporate policy because it is protected. So we feel we've got a pretty solid solution there.
My final question, just wondering your thoughts around data security and data analytics in general. I mean, obviously the amount of data that organizations have is just continually growing, and we keep seeing all these concerns around sharing this data. So just anything that stands out to you that you wanted to touch on? Yeah,
I'd say from a trend perspective, what you're seeing now is, for me, it's pretty compelling. businesses are learning that for them to have an edge, they need to know how to leverage their data. So while they've got to control it and they've got to lock it down, they've got to make sure they've put measures in place that still allows a business to do their job. And we're seeing much more, how do I put it? I don't want to say power, but we're seeing the business put demands on IT now to make sure that they can meet their requirements with regards to not just data breadth, but data reach, and the diversity of that data. So when you look at what most people do from an analytics perspective and you take it by persona, you'll see data scientists that tend to work with very large data. They're working on very large, complex projects where they're working with, I'll call, Hadoop-sized data. There are handfuls of those. There's not as many as the classic business person who needs to figure out the trends that are going on in their business every single day and how to adapt it, from marketing teams trying to understand lead flow, sales organizations trying to better understand pipeline, product people trying to understand throughput through the systems. So there's all of those different challenges that they have, and getting at such a wide variety of data is becoming more and more important, because getting it from one silo doesn't work. So, for example, if Dan were told all he could use was Salesforce, he'd pull his hair out. Then he'd say, okay, I'm only going to allow you to use Salesforce and Pardot. He's going to go, well, what about the finance information that I need? So then he's going to get that, and then he might look and say, well, hey, can I look at support trends to see if people are, what kind of maintenance renewal are we getting on the product? So then he's got to go through that and then say, well, I would ask, well, with all that, are we having product quality challenges that maybe someone needs to take a look at? Is that affecting, repurchase? So as you look at data, and every question that comes up, it typically involves a net new data source. So if you don't have that breadth or that capability to get at it, that's an issue. Then you can argue, well, if people can work with enough people in the organization, they can get that reach, but it still takes months or even years of people to get the data that they wanted in the first place. With this new trend, with the stuff that we're doing from data prep and allowing people to get at documents, which are in effect time-stamped data marts, we can actually give somebody access to the data that they already have in seconds. So the amount of time that we're going to save somebody to do their job and give them the data, access to the data, believe it or not, that they already have, is a huge, huge, huge gain for them. And I think that's going to continue to grow as businesses need to become way more agile in going after the data that they need.
And that wraps up this episode of the Cyber Chat. The Cyber Chat podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs helps organizations and service providers quickly establish a strategic cyber threat intelligence operation that drives more effective use of their tactical defenses. For a weekly recap of important cybercrime news, check out Surfwatch Labs' other podcast, the Surfwatch Cyber Risk Roundup. And for more information on cyber risk intelligence, check out surfwatchlabs.com.